Anna Harvey is an associate professor of politics at New York University. She's also the author of this book, A Mere Machine: The Supreme Court, Congress, and American Democracy. Professor Harvey, what's your thesis?
Well, I guess I would say the book is really more about two questions. The first question is when the Supreme Court decides constitutional cases, so it's making rulings on the constitutionality of, say, federal statutes, does it do so independently of the elected branches? And, you know, most people, I think, would argue that the answer to that question is yes. So one of the things I do is I teach introductory American politics at NYU. And I can tell you that pretty much every textbook I've ever seen says some combination of the following. The justices have life tenure. They have salaries that are protected by the Constitution that can't be diminished. And as a consequence, they decide cases independently of the elected branches. And furthermore, that's probably a good thing. So just thinking about the first kind of part of that, the claim that the court decides cases independently, that's what most of the book is about, is examining that and saying, well, is any of that true? And the first two parts of the claim are definitely not true. So the justices don't have life tenure. I mean, that's easy. You can just look at the Constitution. They have something we call good behavior tenure, which means that they can be removed by the House and the Senate. We know that. They can be impeached under very vaguely worded grounds. The second part of it, that the claim that the justices have salaries that are protected, is also not true. So the Congress can't explicitly lower the justices' salaries while they're sitting on the bench. But if salaries erode because of inflation, there's no requirement that the Congress increase the justices' salaries to keep pace with inflation. So in essence, the Congress can lower the justices' salaries simply by failing to increase them. And then the third claim, which is that therefore they decide cases independently, that's kind of what I set out to answer, to figure out, is that really true? And, you know, there's a lot of nitty-gritty about collecting, you know, so how would you test that rigorously? How do you figure out whether that's true? And there's a lot of choices you have to make about how are you going to measure things and how are you going to deal with, you know, the fact that we don't have nice randomized controlled trials. We're dealing with social science. We just have the data we observe in the world. So there's a lot of that. And my approach in the book was really to try to be as transparent as possible. So, you know, I'm really suggesting that a lot of what we teach in, you know, our introductory American politics classes in universities, a lot of what we teach in high school, a lot of what we think is the case is probably wrong. And so I therefore wanted to be sure to have as much of the details kind of there in the book so that, you know, you could check me. You know, I'm happy to tell you that the court's not independent, but the approach of the book really is to say, look, here's the evidence, and sort of lay it all out and say, here's what I did. Here's how you could replicate this. And, you know, after all that, the kind of surprising thing is that the court actually appears to be fairly dramatically responsive to the preferences of the elected branches, the Congress in particular. So, meaning that when, you know, when preferences in Congress change, when the Congress gets more liberal or more conservative, you can see the court's decisions, even in constitutional cases, you can see them following congressional preferences. And, you know, one time period where it's really, you can see it very clearly, was during the Renquist Court. So the Renquist Court sat between 1986 and 2004, really. And what's nice about the Renquist Court is you have a court that really from the very beginning had a majority on the court appointed by Republican presidents, so a fairly conservative majority on the court. And throughout the 1980s, there was a lot of concern from liberals in the country that this was a court that was going to erode many of the protections for civil rights and liberties that had been established by the Warren Court and kind of held in place by the Burger Court. So this was a court that liberals were worried about. And And, 1986, 1987, 1988 passed, and nothing, the Renquist Court is not really taking on those liberal precedents. And by the end of really 1993, after the court has essentially upheld Roe v. Wade, has essentially upheld race and redistricting, has, preserved a number of the policies that liberals were worried about, the observers of the court kind of throw in the towel and they say, you know what, we thought this was going to be a dangerous conservative court and it didn't turn out that way. And it happens the very next term is the term when all of a sudden the court changes course. And this is the Renquist Court, from 1994 on is the court that began striking gun control and, the Americans with Disability Act and, striking a number of federal protections that had been enacted by Democratic Congresses. And people started calling the Renquist Court. There was the first Renquist Court between 1986 and 1993, and there was a second Renquist Court. And nobody really knew what had happened. And so one of the empirical contributions of the book is to say, well, something did happen. There was a big, important congressional election in 1994, and the House turns over. There's a huge turnover in the House, right? Contract with America. And we can estimate actually exactly how much of an effect that congressional turnover had on the court's decisions, controlling for a bunch of other things. And if we just use the cases that the court, hears, so we're just using kind of the sample of cases on the court's docket every year, the effect of the Congress changing over between 1993 and 1994 from majority Democratic to majority Republican is an increase of about 50 percentage points in the likelihood that the court would strike a liberal statute. So it's a fairly large effect. It basically takes the court from having a fairly low probability that it would strike a liberal statute, around 15 to 20%, to having, 65 to 70%, which, takes you from being mostly likely to uphold liberal statutes to mostly likely to strike them. So it's a big effect. If we do something slightly more sophisticated and we take into account the fact that the court kind of selectively chooses its docket, so we're not getting a random sample of cases to look at in each term, so we kind of address what we call selection bias in the court's docket, we estimate an even larger effect. So it now becomes about 70 percentage points. So it's a very large effect for social sciences. So most of the book is about kind of laying that out and walking through the history of the court, including the Warren Court, the Burger Court, the Renquist Court, and showing both with the quantitative data and also kind of what people saw and talked about as these justices were deciding cases, how we can see this responsiveness in action. So for example, the Renquist Court is a time when there's a conservative majority that basically pulls its punches for its first, 7 years, its first 7 terms, and then seems to let give free rein to the justices' preferences. The Warren Court's a different court. The Warren Court is a court that largely has a friendly Democratic majority in Congress throughout most of its career. So you have a court that's really working in tandem with the elected branches. There's not an obvious constraint. But we can simulate what would have happened had there been a more oppositional Congress, a much more conservative Congress. And the results of those simulations suggest that, we tend to think of the Warren Court as having been this, very independent guarantor of civil rights and individual rights during that period. And what the evidence is now suggesting about that period is that the Warren Court was able to be the Warren Court because it had a supportive Democratic Congress, that the Warren Court would not have been able to have issued many of those rulings had it faced a different Congress. And so, we need to think about that court as having worked in tandem with a friendly Congress. So much of the book is kind of laying out the evidence for the claim that the Supreme Court is in fact much more democratically accountable and responsive than maybe we thought it was previously. The second question the book addresses is, well, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Having a more responsive court as opposed to a more independent court. And that's really, I think, you know, the more interesting and important policy question. What kind of a court do you want? We